Well, hello, and thank you for taking your time to review this important information. My name is Brad Vandervet, and I am with the Minnesota Department of Corrections in the Risk Assessment and Community Notification Meeting or Unit. And today I'm going to go over with you some important information, not only about the individual you're here to learn about today, but also the broader context of the state's risk management system and how it relates to individuals like this person so that you can apply it more broadly in your family and community safety planning efforts. And then I'll go on into some resources so that you can better apply this most effectively. So, where I find that meetings like this make the most sense to really begin and start at is with what we all know as a community and all have a basic understanding around. And that is that those individuals who engage in this kind of harmful conduct, sexual crimes, and sexual harm, they exist. And within our communities, really the question becomes then what are we doing as agencies, all state level, county level, and down to the local level to address those individuals who we have identified and become aware of through their criminal conduct and histories. And that's what I'm going to go into more information on. But keep in mind as we go into this that of those that we know about, we know from research and data that there's actually a far larger number of those who have not been reported to law enforcement. So I want to place in your mind a funnel analogy as we go forward. And so, of those crimes that occur within communities, we know only a percentage go on to get reported to law enforcement. And of that percentage, only a portion of them will go on to receive formal charges from the county attorney's office. And from that portion, only a smaller group of that will go on to receive sentences. And of those sentenced, an even smaller portion yet will go on to cross the threshold of a prison institution. So have this in your mind of this narrowing funneling effect as we go forward. So one of the first components of the state's risk management system that I want to share with you today is probably one of the most foundational, and that is the registry. Now, the registry came online in 1991 and is really born out of the efforts and advocacy of families and advocacy groups, starting with the Jacob Wetterling family after the abduction of Jacob and on into other advocacy groups where they went around throughout the state and beyond and asked law enforcement, what more can we do to provide you the best tools possible in achieving the best results in this hard work you're doing day in and day out? And law enforcement said really resoundingly, what we need is a method that collates all of our data, because before the registry came online, this important information was housed in each individual agency's files and would be shared among other agencies only after the fact when somebody became known to them. With the registry, this information exists in real time so that law enforcement across the state can access it readily by making and model of a vehicle, a license plate number, or a description of an individual. They can do so much so very quickly, and it's increased that responsivity factor very much. And so, with the registry, the next question is often, well, then what does a person that's subject to the registry have to give to law enforcement? What do they get to know? And so, the registry is maintained by the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and it retains data for law enforcement purposes like the individual registrant's primary address. That also includes any secondary addresses, places where they may frequent. Think of places like vacation or rental properties, or even if they're going to like a loved one's house with some frequency or a significant other's house. Those must be known or made known to law enforcement. The registrants must also ensure that their employment is known to law enforcement. And if they operate a motor vehicle for the purposes of that employment, that also must be made known to law enforcement. If they're enrolled in and actively attending any kind of schooling, be it higher education or vocational, they must register that with law enforcement as well. And then, in addition, any vehicles that the registrant themselves either uses, owns, or possesses must be known to law enforcement. So even the broken down vehicle in the backyard must be known to law enforcement. Now, additional things are things like their phone numbers and any rental property, to include things like storage units. So you can see the robustness of the registry, and remembering that the law that structures the registry determined that the information collected by it is private in nature, and therefore it is for law enforcement purposes only and correctional purposes only. Now, the next question that naturally kind of rolls from this is, well, then who has to register as a predatory offender in the state of Minnesota? And the registry has actually grown and changed since the early 90s when it began. And initially, it focused on those individuals charged with or convicted of any kind of felony level criminal sexual conduct or any kind of sexual conduct crime involving minors, to include possession of child pornography. But the state saw the value of the registry and decided to expand its breadth to include other crimes that are non sex specific, such as kidnapping and false imprisonment. And this is why the name change came online. Some of you may recall it being known as the Sex Offender Registry early on, and then being modified to the Predatory Offender Registry. And an easy way to keep it straight in your mind as we're going forward today into this information is that all sex offenders are predatory offenders, while not all predatory offenders may be sex offenders. So just use that as an easy way to kind of keep it straight. Now, back to that funneling analogy, I like to use this information to really kind of drive home that necessary component of having that broad notification, that broad awareness. So, as you can see, from the first of this year, there were approximately 18,798 registered individuals throughout the state of Minnesota. And so, with a snapshot, a 30,000-foot flyover view of the registry, I could see that as of the 5th of October, that breaks down, as you can see, 2,824 registered predatory offenders in Hennepin County, 155 of whom are designated as those subject to broad public notification. So those either civilly committed individuals who are out on discharge, or those designated risk level 3. As we look down into Golden Valley proper, you can see that there are 13 registrants residing within Golden Valley. At this moment, none of whom are subject to that broad public notification. And so if you were to go on to the Department of Corrections public registrant search today and look for Golden Valley, you would not see it. It would not be listed, because the 13 that reside there are not those subject to that broad notification. Now, after the 12th, when we get into the information about the man you're here to learn about, you'll see that number change to 1, and Golden Valley will appear on that search tool. You can see neighboring communities around, remembering that the number on the left are all of those registered. So that's those with no risk level assigned, level 1 or level 2. And the number to the right are those subject to broad public notification. So those who are either a risk level 3 or those subject to notification because of civil commitment. And so the real takeaway here is that it is unlikely throughout the state of Minnesota, in fact, it's entirely unlikely, that there's a community out there that does not have registrants either residing directly within it or passing through it day in and day out for all manner of reasons. And so that broad awareness is just so very critical as we go forward. Other information I want to share with you about some of those foundational components of the state's risk management system is the Community Notification Act. Now, the Community Notification Act came online in 1997 and is really founded on the knowledge and understanding that a well-informed community is a safer community. And we in the Department of Corrections thank the Golden Valley Police Department in its efforts to ensure that this important information is getting out to the broadest amount of people possible. So, because community notification is the reason we're here today talking to you about this important information, it's worth going into further detail about how it works. And so, as you recall from my earlier slide with the numbers, not all registrants are subject to notification. So, in order for notification to apply, a registered individual must have been released from prison. They must have crossed the threshold of a state prison, not a county jail. That can be other prisons from other states, all 50 states in the union, to include US territories, and also includes federal prisons and military prisons. or those individuals who have been committed through the civil court process for their sexual offending behavior. So it does not apply to those registrants, those individuals who were either juveniles at the time of their sentencing or those who received stayed or probationary sentences as a result of their court order. And so those individuals would fall into the no risk level assigned category. Again, not implying that they have no risk, but more that they have not been assessed and measured. So then we get into, well, for those that cross the threshold, who does what then? Well, with the Department of Corrections, what we've been tasked with is the assessment of an assignment of that risk level. And the way we do that in the DOC is through the End of Confinement Review Committee, or the ECRC. 90 days prior to a registered individual's release into the community at that final third of their supervision, or earlier, they are assessed by the End of Confinement Review Committee through the Risk Assessment Unit. And they use a number of actuarial based risk assessment tools. Chief among them is the MinSOST, or the Minnesota Sex Offender Screening Tool. Now, this tool is an important component of the things we're going to talk about today, as it is the founding document for our risk assessment process. The State Department of Corrections engaged in a lengthy study that spanned over a decade initially, from the early 90s all the way into the early 2000s, where they followed over 3,166 known sex offenders into the community at their release. And that study marked their successes and it marked their failures. And through that information, it was placed into a scientifically reviewed document and ultimately passed that muster to become our actuarial based risk assessment tool. And it is how we determine risk levels. So when I speak today about a level 1 registrant or a level 2 or a level 3, know that I'm speaking specifically to that peer group. So if I say somebody has a lower amount of risk, I'm saying as compared to that peer group, a moderate amount of risk as compared to that peer group, or a higher amount of risk as compared to that group. Now, one thing to remember about risk assessment tools is this, is that no tool can predict the future. It's not what they are designed to do. What they do, however, is assist law enforcement and corrections in creating strong safety plans to support a healthy reintegration so that these individuals can apply the tools and skills they've learned while they were in the institution into the community under the watchful eyes of supervision and law enforcement successfully, so that when they do come off of their supervision term and expire, and they do expire, that they've instilled those core components to manage and modify their own behavior for a lifetime. So once a risk level has been assessed and assigned, then the responsibility goes to law enforcement. And law enforcement will provide notification within the scope of the risk level given. For level 1 individuals, law enforcement will notify other law enforcement agencies or correctional agencies. They will notify victims of or witnesses to the offense if they've requested that level of enhanced notification. And they will notify other immediate adult household members residing in that home with that registered individual. And that is the scope of a level 1 notification. With a level 2 notification, it expands where law enforcement can notify those individuals and entities we just described in level 1. And in addition, law enforcement may designate other individuals or entities that they deem to be at particular risk based on that registrant's known pattern of offending conduct and behavior. And so it's often believed that with this group, that means law enforcement will notify schools and daycares and churches and things of that nature. And while that may very well be true, it is not always the case. So, in a scenario where law enforcement receives notification on a level 2 registrant entering their community, and they determine through the review of the packet of information provided to them by the Risk Assessment and Community Notification Unit that this individual focuses their behavior and conduct on adult females at social gatherings. Think places like bars or concert venues or things of that nature. In that scenario, law enforcement may determine that they're going to focus their notification on the proprietors of those venues and those bars so that they can enact whatever safety planning and security protocols they have in place versus the local daycare that serves children from birth or infancy to school age, where that would only maybe serve to confuse and incite fear in that group and do nothing to mitigate or serve public safety more broadly. Now, on the flip side, law enforcement with a level two may determine after reviewing this person's packet that they focus their energy and attention on those unaccompanied minors. Think teens in transit from school or after school activities to home. And law enforcement knows of a local community hangout spot where teens are known to congregate and socialize in those down times. So in this case, law enforcement may go to that proprietor and let them know, hey, if you see this individual in this area establishing relationships, talking with the children, or loitering about, give us a call and let us know. We're going to come out and chat with him and find out more about what he may be up to. And so that is the nuance of a level two notification. And then with level three notification, law enforcement then provides broad public notice. And that comes in many different shapes and forms. It really comes down to how law enforcement best communicates with its community. And again, we recognize and thank Golden Valley PD and all of its efforts to get this information out to you as soon as possible. So, with all this data and research that the Department of Corrections has conducted, I want to share some of those findings so that you can apply them to the safety plans you're looking to either create or augment. And the narrowest part of that funnel is where we're going to start with that information, is at that group that has crossed the threshold and been assigned a risk level. And we know that's already at the narrowing end. And so, of those that cross the threshold of the prison system year after year, that number does fluctuate and change. However, the breakdown of risk level assignments tends to stay fairly static. And as you can see, the 15 percentile average for level three is assigned, and that is the group we get to share more broadly. And so you can see just how important it is to use the information from that smaller group and apply it to all of those interactions you may be having with anyone in and around your communities and neighborhoods, because we don't get to know about everybody that's been assigned a risk level. And we know that those that have been assigned a risk level are a very small portion of those who have engaged in this kind of conduct and behavior. So use this information as we go forward. Another snapshot in time, just to kind of give you that real final point. As of the 5th of October, there were 450 registrants in the community around Minnesota subject to this notification level. 8 of them have their addresses is currently unknown, and they are out of compliance with that registry requirement and need to be brought back into compliance. And so again, you can see just with that group, as small as that is compared to that 18,700 some, that broad awareness is just so very critical, because we know that they don't just exist where their head hits the pillow at night. It's where they're spending their waking hours where we need to have that broadest awareness. Some other information I want to share with you today as you're thinking about those safety plans. I actually pulled this from the US Department of Justice study, as it parallels very closely the state's studies findings. And I want to just give you some other corresponding information. But the breakdowns, as we've known through all this information that we've researched, when it comes to the relationships of those who engage in this kind of harm and the people they hurt, we know that the majority of those people are known to the victims, and they use that relationship or that knowing to exploit that trust that they've built. That smallest percentage that falls in the stranger category, 7%. And now this is the group that gives us the most pause as loved ones and parents and community members, as it should. Because as you're thinking about these breakdowns, you're going, Brad, I have the ability to determine who comes into my kid's life from the family side, and I can set those appropriate boundaries where I see fit. Absolutely. And furthermore, I can determine who gets to have that acquaintanceship, that knowledge and relationship with my loved ones. And so I can do a lot to vet and decide who gets to have that kind of contact. And that is so very true. And so that stranger group is the one that gives us the most pause because this is the group where we do not have direct influence or control. And so it's worth breaking down to some detail what really was going on with these studies, what they did and what they could not do. And so, in order for the researchers to create a good data set, they had to formulate a cutoff point. And so they determined that their cutoff was going to be 24 hours. If through the research of the available information, the researcher could not determine that the victim and the offender knew each other for 24 hours or better, they went into the stranger pile. And so inevitably what that led to were scenarios where, say, two teens meet up at a house party, and maybe they went to the same school, but they were not known to one another. They meet up with the group all together, and the night's going the way it's going, and they move to a more secluded area or leave together of their own free will and accord, no longer under the watchful eyes of the group. And the night takes an awful turn. Now, this scenario, that victim and perpetrator would fall into the stranger category. But what we tend to think of more as parents and family when we think of strangers is that person lurking just beyond our awareness, just outside our scope of knowledge, who has ill intent. Now, that group falls into a much smaller percentage, into about a 3% category. That is cold comfort. I am well aware. But as you are thinking about how to apply your finite resources, both in your families and community safety plans, keep in mind that we don't want you pouring all of your energy and attention into that lowest 3% category. We need that awareness broad because we know that the majority of those who engage in this type of harm are using and building relationships in order to achieve their goals. Other information and data I want to share with you as you're contemplating this information further is the age breakdowns of those harmed. Now, as you're looking at this information, you're going to see that it's broken into thirds, but very quickly, you're going to see that two-thirds of this group are children. And then you're going to look even more closely and you're going to see that the narrowest age range on here, 13 to 17, constitutes 33% of those harmed. That's 9% of the population, and that is worth getting into some more detail about. So what we know as society, as communities, from our experiences and learning from victim notification and community advocacy groups and so on, is that with that age range, that early 0 to 12 age range, the parents and trusted loved ones are still very much in control of what's going on with that child. But what happens when they start to get into those critical teenage years is the very thing we work so hard as a society and as communities to achieve. And that is an environment where our kids can go out and express their autonomy and formulate their own relationships outside of that ever present watchful gaze. And they deserve every bit of that. But that is the part that makes them particularly vulnerable because now they are formulating relationships outside of the knowledge of their trusted adult support network. And so, as advocacy groups and state agencies go, we've come away from that older model of the talk, where we pull our teen aside at that critical age and we pull back the veil just enough to show them that the world may not be or is not as safe as it had been made to be for them when they were younger. Now, often this will be met with one of two very distinct reactions from the teen. Either it will generate fear in them, or it will generate doubt and distrust. They'll say, "No, mom and dad, the world is not as scary as you say it is." And either way, we find that that was not as effective. So the model that we've engaged in now is one of a lot of little talks, all the way up and through childhood, building upon each other in an age appropriate way, growing along with the child so as not to incite fear, but to also build those safety and support nets internally with them so that they have it when and if those trusted adult support networks aren't readily available. because most kids are pretty good at picking up on a what we'll call a red light or danger situation. But where it gets harder for children is if it's one of those more yellow light or cautious moments. And a question often comes up, well, how do I say no to someone I like? And so we need our kids to understand, as much as we don't want to generate fear, because we know that scared kids do not equal safer kids. But we also need our kids to understand that nice people do not always equal safe people. So I will provide you with some additional resources so that you can start to work and modify those family safety plans to structure those talks in a way that works best for your families. Now, I want to switch gears and use all the information I've provided you thus far as an overlay as we get into the specific details about the man you're here to learn about today. This is Terrell Coleman. First, I want to speak about photographs. Photographs are updated on average of every 12 months, so annually, or should the subject significantly change or modify their appearance. So if you were to see Mr. Coleman in the community and see that he has dramatically changed the way he looks, certainly reach out to either law enforcement or his corrections agent or both and let them know. And they will attain updated photos and get them onto the predatory offender registry, where I will get them and put them up onto the public registrant search or the web, so that you will always have an accurate photographic depiction of this man for as long as he is subject to broad notification. These are Mr. Coleman's vitals. He's currently 35 years of age and will be residing at the 1900 block of Glenwood Parkway here in Golden Valley. Now, often in meetings like this, a question will come up, well, Brad, can you tell us where he lives specifically? It would give us a great deal of comfort if we knew where his head hit the pillow at night. And you'll remember back to my information on the registry being private data for law enforcement purposes only, and so therefore cannot be shared. However, we accomplish a lot with proximal addresses. No doubt those who live among and around this community will see Mr. Coleman once he's moved there as he comes and goes throughout his day to day activities. And you will become aware of where he's living at, and you will share that information among one another. And that's just fine. But what we do not want as agencies is for that information, that private data, to get out in a broad public sphere where somebody from beyond the Golden Valley community who has no stake in what goes on in the neighborhood comes in and exacts some vigilante revenge scenario that does nothing to mitigate risk, does nothing to prevent harm, and only serves to disrupt the very things you've worked so hard to maintain and achieve. This is Mr. Coleman's registrable offense history. This has been provided to you on the fact sheets. It's pulled directly from them. Just know that this is not an exhaustive criminal history. We're speaking specifically to that conduct that placed him onto the registry and was ultimately weighted in his risk level assessment and determination. And so if you're interested in his full criminal history, you can certainly take a look at that. It is publicly available on both the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's public criminal history search function and through the state courts search function. So I want to get right into the details about what put Mr. Coleman on the registry and led to his risk level assessment. In 2007, Mr. Coleman was convicted of a criminal sexual conduct in the second degree out of Hennepin County. This crime was against a 41-year-old female whom he did not know. He was 21 years of age at the time. This offense occurred at about just before 10 a.m. on a weekday. And Mr. Coleman was on the sidewalk while this victim passed him by, and he engaged her in conversation and used the politeness that we utilize as a method by which to close the distance between him and this female, asking questions, engaging her in conversation, and she, not wanting to seem rude or offensive, answered him back and allowed him to close that distance. Once he got close enough to her, he engaged in force to pull her off the sidewalk between two adjacent buildings, where he began to assault her. She called for help. Neighbors heard the call, contacted law enforcement, and law enforcement responded quickly as they were in that area at the time. As they pulled up, he took off running. She identified him. Law enforcement was able to make visual contact and see who he was, and were able to find him later. And for his crime, he was convicted and sentenced to a 95-month commit to the Commissioner of Corrections with a 10-year conditional release period. Now, I'm going to use this moment to just talk about and answer another question that often comes up in meetings like this. And that is, Brad, how is it that our system is set up so that someone who engages in this kind of harm that shocks the conscience, how is it that they get to come back out and re enter the community and our society? What is going on here? And the answer to that question lies in part here in determinate sentencing. Prior to determinate sentencing, the state had a system of parole. And that was way back before, it was the early 80s when it switched over. And with cases like these that were detestable and were shocking to that public conscience, it was very difficult for those individuals to be granted parole at the time of their release hearings. And it would often lead to them sitting the full duration of their sentences in the institution. Now, upon hearing that, often the sentiment from the community is, well, that's just fine by us, Brad. He can serve his whole time in prison. Thank you very much. But what we found from all of our research and data that we did back from the 90s all the way up and through the final iteration up in 2012 was that that model was not impacting recidivism in a way that we knew we could do. And so by going to determinate sentencing, we've actually brought that recidivism rate down significantly from 17% at its earliest, which is still very much lower than most communities believe, that is publicly believed, down to, while on ISR, 3% and 5% on average. And so we've through this model done a lot to impact recidivism rates. And the way that's worked is that when the old model was in place, someone like Mr. Coleman would expire from his duration. He would serve out his full sentence and be walked to the gate and told, don't come back, with no additional support or structure on the community side, just an expectation. But now, with determinate sentencing, by law, it is set up that he will serve 2/3 of his sentence in the institution and 1/3 in the community on supervised release. And this ensures that all of the skills and tools that he is required to do while in the institution through treatment, counseling, therapy, and so on are being applied in the community following his release through aftercare programming and so on, under the watchful eyes of a corrections agent and their law enforcement partners to ensure that he is adhering to those things that mitigate and manage risk. And so this is why they come out, because that final third is set by law. Now there are sentence enhancements in place as well, so that where somebody with a 95-month commit that was not a sex offense or a person crime will only serve the 2/3 in and the 1/3 out, and that's the end of their sentence. But in Mr. Coleman's case, there's an enhancer in place so that that final third is now extended for 10 years. So he will be under correctional supervision for 10 years in the community. And that is another additional component so that he has that benefit of continuing to work with that support group of corrections and law enforcement. So Mr. Coleman's prison chronology breaks down like this. In February of 2007, he enters the prison for that CSC2, that criminal sexual conduct second degree. He crosses the threshold. And then he is assessed and assigned by the end of confinement review committee as a risk level 3. And at that final third mark is released into the community onto intensive supervised release, which is another component of that risk management system. He had his release revoked for violations, for technical violations, not new sex offenses. And anytime an individual re-enters the prison for whatever the reason may be, whether it's a revocation of their supervision or potentially new criminal convictions, they are always reassessed. Now, Mr. Coleman was already risk level 3, and so that is our highest risk level assignable, and so nothing changed. But had he been a 1 or a 2, depending on what brought him back, that risk level may have been modified because risk levels are dynamic and they are constantly changing and moving with the individual. And so, again, after he served his accountability time in the institution and did whatever additional programming was required of him, he was re released back into the community on September of 2019, back to ISR, and has been in our community ever since. He is now moving from his current location to the Golden Valley address, as we've described, on the 12th, so next Monday of this year. And so as far as supervision goes for Mr. Coleman, this is kind of the synopsis. He will be under correctional supervision until September 19th of 2022 when he expires from that sentence and his rights will be restored to him with the exception of the registry. He is required to be registered for life. And so law enforcement, regardless of what risk level he may end up with, because risk levels again are dynamic, and he may show that he has reduced his risk enough to get a lower level assigned. But for his life, he will be known to law enforcement where he lives, where he works, what he drives, etc. So the next component I want to talk about with you in that broader risk management system is the intensive supervised release program. Now, this actually came on before the registry in 1990. And really is founded on that public safety component that is met through a rigid adherence and structure to ensure that those individuals that are subject to ISR are being held highly accountable. This is how they reduce risk, by ensuring that every step of the day is managed and monitored by corrections staff. And this is how they help to structure a safe and effective reentry into the community, remembering that that sentence will expire and they will be off supervision. So ensuring that they're instilling and internalizing those mitigators to manage their own conduct and behavior as they go forward and come off supervision so that they can go on to lead and continue a quiet life. The release planning process of ISR is very collaborative. They work alongside their institutional partners, case managers, working to formulate the most effective release plan possible. That's through working with treatment options and providers, working through victim services and support groups there, working through other community-based supports that we know mitigate risk, job opportunities, treatment opportunities, access to supports, and things of that nature, transportation, so they can get to and from work, and so on. Once they've identified a safe and stable location, remembering that they're coming out, they have to come out by law. And the worst case scenario is homelessness. Homelessness increases risk by destabilizing that individual. They don't have an easy place where they can hang their hat, so to speak, and establish or reestablish their lives. They're bouncing around from friend's house to friend's house, from community to community, and it's a burden and a hardship on law enforcement to have to track those individuals. So we want them in a place, even if that place may not be the most ideal, it's better than homelessness. So those coming out for their initial release, they'll be placed on monitoring, electronic monitoring. That monitoring, once they've progressed through their stages of intensive supervised release successfully, will come off, but can always be added back on should the need arise. The agents use a very deep toolbox of a lot of different things, from those monitoring tools to those treatment tools. The agents will transport the individual from the institution to their home, and once they're in the community, make sure they're checking in on them pretty frequently. This program is unique in Minnesota in that it operates just like law enforcement, 24/7, 365. It's very highly structured and it functions on a very reduced caseload. We're talking down into the teens per agent, when an average agent, just to give you some context, will manage an enhanced sex offender caseload can be around 50 to 60 clients, and a non sex offender caseload can be upwards of around 80 clients per probation officer. And so you can see with just down in the double digits into the teens, these agents have an opportunity to get to know these individuals very, very well and get to know what they're doing well, where they're succeeding, and where they may be struggling, and formulating and focusing their energies and efforts on those areas where struggle may be occurring. Random frequent checks, face-to-face contacts, and daily call-ins. So all their activity in the community must be pre-approved by their supervising agent well in advance of them doing it. And so just know that that's a very highly accountable program. This is the intensive supervised release team that is going to be working with Mr. Coleman. This is the direct agent, Mr. Fletcher, and his supervisor, Ms. Schultz, and they are out of the Hennepin County Community Corrections Office. And so if you have questions about supervision, if you've seen Mr. Coleman in the community and you're just not sure if he's allowed to be there or if he had permission, and you want to know more about his release and how he's doing, certainly Mr. Fletcher is a great source of contact to assist you with that. If you see Mr. Coleman or anybody now, as your awareness has been broadened further, that may be engaging in imminent harm or getting into something where you're really starting to worry about the safety and welfare of others or even himself, certainly reach out to your local law enforcement. This is your best and most direct source of assistance for not only Mr. Coleman, but this entire topic. If you see anything that just stands out to you as being out of place, again, knowing that law enforcement knows of all of the registrants in and around your community, and you see somebody that's just engaging in behavior that just makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, call 911, get this information to law enforcement. Oftentimes communities think that if they just post it onto like social media, things like Nextdoor or Facebook, that's the extent of what needs to happen. Law enforcement will see it from there. But know that social media is not actively policed. If you need law enforcement to know, and with these types of concerns, you definitely want them to know, is make sure you're taking that next step to notify law enforcement directly. If you have questions about policing and how Golden Valley is working on any unique initiatives with this population within and around the city, certainly call their non emergency number and they'll be happy to provide you with additional information and resources. As for resources, when it comes to having those talks that we discussed earlier with our children in those age appropriate ways, I want you to know that one of your best resources, and just I think a cornerstone of those resources that I'm going to share with you going forward, is the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. They are the subject matter experts. Oftentimes in meetings like these where we're able to talk back and forth, people will ask, well, Brad, my kid has special needs. How do I formulate a safety plan to meet those hurdles? This is one of your best resources for those kinds of questions. And I want you to have them readily available for you as you're going forward. Other resources I want to share with you today is we're talking about this topic, is your local victim services provider. Now, what we know, what the statistics we have and the data we're aware of, is that the odds of somebody who's viewing this information today having been either impacted directly by this kind of harm or knowing or supporting somebody who has been impacted by this kind of harm is high. And because conversations like this inevitably can have a way of tearing open all those old wounds and bringing it all back to bear, I want to make sure that you have your local victim services provider information readily available. If you know of somebody who may be struggling, even just in this time of global pandemics and just a very stressful time with school in blended learning situations or school from home, there's so much being put on families and individuals that something like this can just feel overwhelming. Make sure that we're supporting one another and getting this information in the hands of those who need it most. So, as I conclude my presentation today, I want to just wrap up with the three 90s and the two R's. I know I've thrown a lot at you, and thank you for bearing with me. But if you take nothing else away from what we've talked about today, please let it be this: that from what we know of this population and sexual harm in and around Minnesota, and we know a lot, it's important to remember that 90% of those who engage in this type of harm do not go on to reoffend in a same or similar fashion once they've become known to that full array of that risk management system. Of those who do engage in this type of harm, 90% of them are relationship based. They use their relationship, whether it's familial or extended familial or acquaintance, to exploit trust and to manipulate and manage victims. And so, what that means is that even if today we could take all 18,700 of those registered individuals that we know of in and around our state and put them on the moon, or even just Mr. Coleman, and eliminate them from our immediate society, we would not have impacted our sex assaults by any more than 10% year after year. 90% of those cases that come through our court system every single year that it's been documented through the Sentencing Guidelines Commission and through the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's research and data is committed by those who have not been known to the system as sex offenders. 10% or less are those known. And so having that broad awareness is just so critical. Use the information we've been able to share about this man and apply it broadly to all relationships, to how we're going to work in our safety plans uniquely. Ladies and gentlemen, it really genuinely does come down to that relationship component, not residence. That social proximity that they get to have, those who intend to do harm get to have with those they mean to harm, is so much more telling than geographical proximity ever could be: distance from where their head hits the pillow at night to where children may congregate, because we know that these individuals, where they are asleep at night is where their risk is at its lowest. Where they spend their waking hours is where we need to have our awareness at its highest. And we know that they are crossing all kinds of boundaries every day for all manner of reasons. They are not just staying static in one city. And so, again, broad awareness is just so key. Other resources I want to make sure you have as you're continuing on this process of getting all the best details and data available are just a snapshot here. It's the tip of the iceberg, but don't let this be the last bit of information you receive on this important topic. As you find other resources and information and you're wondering about its validity, if you think it's a supportive resource or a good resource in that it's been vetted through the scientific process, certainly contact any of those entities I've shared with you earlier and ask them if a resource you found is reputable. They'll be happy to assist you with that. Lastly, as far as state specific resources go, I'd mentioned earlier with Mr. Coleman, and if you want to know his criminal history or anyone's criminal history in the state of Minnesota, you can utilize the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's public criminal history search function. All you need is that individual's first name, last name, and date of birth. And if you are a trusted loved one or a parent who's vetting someone coming into a child or children's lives, be it a volunteer at a program, a coach, a tutor, a teacher, or whatever the case may be, a babysitter, you can utilize this tool. And I would argue that anybody you're vetting, if they are unwilling to give you their first name, last name, and date of birth, should not be allowed to be on your short list of consideration. Other resources I've talked about throughout this presentation are all the research and data publications I've referenced are available in their pure form, not just broken down pie charts. So if you're like me and naturally skeptical of some guy sitting on a webcam showing you slides, you can go onto that website. You can look at this research yourself, read through it, and draw your own conclusions. If you can't find it, give me a call. I'll be happy to assist you in getting there. We also maintain the offender locator. That is for anybody who is subject to the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections, regardless of whether or not they're in for a sex offense or something else. If you happen to know of, or you're tracking or following somebody who's gone through the justice system and has entered prison, and you want to know what their status is, this is your search tool. And then lastly, that 450 some I shared with you earlier, of those subject to broad public notification in and around Minnesota communities right now, and those 8 who are out of compliance, they all exist on that public registrant search function. Now, often it's confused with the registry. Many will look at that public registrant search and presume it's the state's sex offender registry. It is not. That only has the 450 some we talked about, not the 18,700 some that are on the registry. So as we prepare for the Q&A, after you've reviewed this information, know that the Golden Valley Police Department will be doing a live Q&A through the WebEx meeting system on the 12th of October, this coming Monday at 6 p.m. If you're able to jot down questions that you would like more information on, or something that didn't get answered in this presentation and you want to know more about, certainly log into that meeting and present your question. We will be there to answer them. If you're unable to attend that meeting, make sure you're reaching out with your questions. I know the Golden Valley PD will be putting out in their notice some other resources, emails to call in or emails to write in with your questions. Certainly utilize those to get your questions answered. Again, I want to thank you for your time in watching this full video, and I want to thank the Golden Valley Police Department and the opportunity to present to you today.